Thank you. So welcome to the Blameless Cloud. And this talk is about how Jay, Paul, and I brought and are bringing actionable retrospectives to Salesforce. So I am Kevina Finn-Braun. I am the Director of Site Reliability Service Management for Salesforce. Prior to joining Salesforce, I led business continuity at Yahoo. If you'd like to tweet me as we're going through our presentation, I am at Finn-Braun on Twitter. And in my spare time, I am prepping for the zombie apocalypse.
I'm Paul Reed. I go by J. Paul Reed on Twitter, although you might have heard me as Sober Build Eng. There's a long story behind that. But this slide is mostly about tweeting me, so if you want to do a live actionable retrospective on Twitter, that's totally cool. Also do a podcast called The Ship Show, if that's your thing. We talk about build engineering, DevOps, release management, and everything in between on the show. Actually, we were laughing about this. The program had a typo in it. I am not the Director of Site Reliability at Salesforce. I'm not doing Kevina's job. I'm actually a principal consultant at Release Engineering Approaches. And I talk to organizations of all shapes and sizes about the DevOps.
Site reliability at Salesforce. What are we? What do we do? And who are we? We're a globally dispersed team. We have a focus on remediating operational service impacting incidents, but more importantly, learning from those service impacting incidents. Also, we analyze chronic problems and look for solutions to them, and we try to drive resiliency improvements and operational improvements throughout Salesforce. So what brought J. Paul Reed and I together? We were facing some hurdles at Salesforce. We had a process that wasn't being consistently followed. We also had some inconsistent information.
But why?
Because we had some siloed boundaries for incident handling and remediation activities. They crossed different boundaries of different teams.
But why was that a problem?
Because we had some lack of clarity in service ownership and who owned what and how and why.
But why did you have that, Kevina?
Because we had some restructuring that we did, and we split some things off. And we did try and solve it, though, with a giant meeting once a week that was really heavyweight, and that's how we tried to solve it.
But Kevin, why? I'm still confused.
Stop asking me why.
So you may have noticed I asked why a specific number of times. And that was one of the other things that we were working with, is sort of this idea of the old view of human error, where we talk about things like 5 whys, root cause analysis, using language like, why didn't your team do this? Why didn't your team notice those metrics were down? Your team should have done that. And also talking a lot about best practices. So that was actually one of the hurdles that we found as well. So this is a slide from Adam Jacobs' talk on DevOps Kung Fu, a talk he gave earlier this year. And what I like about it is that it's actually, his keynote is something like an hour long. But he talks about incidents lead to postmortems, where you invoke the space, describe the incident, establish a timeline, identify contributing factors, describe customer impact, describe remediation tasks, and describe improvement tasks for response improvement. What's interesting about that is that's actually how quickly he goes over it in his talk. He does that in 15 seconds. So when you're talking about, like, what does the structure of sort of a new view modern postmortem look like, this is it. I guess we can all go home now, right? But it turns out that in complex organizations like Salesforce and a lot of the organizations that you're probably all a part of, it takes a little more than 15 seconds to just go through this list and say, hey, let's do a postmortem. And that's where a lot of our work focused as well. Yeah. So since we've invoked the space and we've talked a little bit about the incidents and the problems, let's do the timeline.
So we first met in October of 2014, talked about what we wanted to do, how we wanted to fix things, how we wanted to change things. And, subsequent meetings, January rolls around and we say, well, we need to blow up this big meeting that we have. That was one of the first things we did. Shortly following that, we did a status check in April where we shared the assessment with our senior leaders and got some feedback on what we were doing and what worked and what didn't work. And then in May, I'd like to think as a result of that status assessment, we had a shift in service ownership roles and responsibilities where there was, I'd like to call a stake put in the ground on who would do what.
One of the interesting things we noticed about the status assessment, too, is that a lot of it was things that people knew. It was one of those, this was an example of where you actually were in the forest and you could see the trees, but it was able to add some color, maybe color the leaves, color the birds, about sort of what was going on, to contextualize it a little better. So in July, we did an initial workshop with the larger group about the new view to sort of introduce them the new view of retrospectives and postmortem. So introduce them to those concepts and start getting people sort of thinking about that. In August of 2015, we identified a group to pilot the coaching that we were working on. That was the database team at Salesforce that we worked with. And then in August to now, we've also had a real focus on the weekly status meeting. Kevina's going to talk more about that. But we wanted to make sure that we were looking at what the teams were doing and how they were contributing to the larger meeting. And I can remember, actually, we did a lot of like debriefs right after that meeting to figure out what was going on.
Our own retros. We retroed our retros.
Yes. And then, of course, we were continued working weekly sessions with the database team. We're getting them to focus on their data presentation, collection, and narrative, which we'll talk about as well.
So one of the first things we did in our October meeting was we retroed our current process. This was a process that I created after talking to several people. It was created about 2 years ago by the time Jay Paul and I first talked. We realized what worked and what didn't work. And as we went through this, I realized a couple of things. I realized that while I had designed this process to fit all of our incidents, what we were really only focusing on was the big high-profile incidents, and that was mainly because I also anchored this process around this big Wednesday meeting.
Yeah, so one of the things we did, this flow diagram, you're probably familiar with the nice process flow diagram, and it's all crisp and clean. And one of the things we did is that we did a value stream map of the incidents that come through this process. And we found out that when you actually go around and look at what that flow looks like from a kind of a value stream map perspective, it looks a little different in real life. It's kind of interesting. One of the things we found when we were looking at how it actually plays out is you can kind of see there's kind of a highlighter mark there, fairly evident silo transition. So where incidences are actually crossing kind of silo boundaries. That was kind of an interesting thing that we sort of noticed. Another interesting thing, you can see this up in the upper right-hand corner. There's a big arrow, a swooping arrow, kind of the left upper-hand corner. And that was an example of where people that needed information to do their jobs, the process didn't account for that. Now, that doesn't mean those people weren't talking to each other. They totally were. It's just when we designed that process, it was something that or actually when Kevina designed it, it was something that we sort of didn't account for or figured out when we actually ran the process. We did a sample of incidents, and we found that there were some consistent inconsistencies. So what we found is that certain parts of the process were actually just like clockwork. Yep. Adhered to very well, the inputs and outputs very defined, got a lot of good data out of that. But then we found that some teams would take that curated data almost about the incident with all the information, and then they would just kind of set it aside and do their own thing. And a lot of those happened, again, across the transition boundaries. And then, of course, the meeting that Kevina was talking about, there's this Bermuda blob at the bottom where incidences go into the triangle, and maybe they come out and maybe they don't. So that was another kind of realization that we had. So once we did that, we actually wanted to step back from the value stream map of an incident because it was really important to talk about actionability of retrospectives. This idea that you may do retrospectives, but is the output of those actionable? Are you feeding that back into your organization? So we actually stepped back from the value stream map that we did, and we started looking at what structure could we put in place? What work could we do with the teams to sort of improve this? And we sort of started asking ourselves a lot of questions about why are the team, what are the current stages of the teams? What are they working on? What makes it that they aren't necessarily taking all of the data that we collect during an outage or an incident? And we found out, is the weather good for doing the kind of improvement work that we need to do? And we found a lot of the teams were sort of running into this. It's like, oh, flying cow in their day-to-day lives.
No cows were harmed in the making of this prezo.
So we decided to actually go for a lighter touch and do sort of mini experiments. They're lightweight. They're easy to conduct. Oftentimes, people weren't even aware that we were doing an experiment. In fact, it was so funny. Kevin and I were talking about some of the larger meetings where we would make minor, small tweaks, and people would come up to us after the meeting and they say, "Wow, that meeting was like shorter. Mm-hmm. It was a shorter meeting, which is great because it was like a 3-hour. It used to be a 3-hour meeting, yeah. Or that meeting just felt better, and we were able to look back at some of the small, minor tweaks that we were doing." It also made it easier for larger changes that we were going to make.
So we decided to head first right into that storm and just go for it. I decided after talking with Preet and after some feedback from our execs to understand what information they wanted to get out of this meeting, that we just needed to blow it up. We needed to start over, from the language we used to what we called it to how it was structured. And the other thing we realized is that we really needed to focus on these smaller cloud level retrospectives rather than trying to do a big giant one. Salesforce is made up of several different clouds who actually do the retrospectives, and so we wanted to really focus in those areas. So the first thing we started with was language. Language matters. We talk every day. I'm up here talking. Jay Paul's up here talking. The first thing we did was change the name of the meeting. It went from being called the high availability meeting, which had a lot of connotations of bad retrospectives and bad blood, into being called the weekly service reliability review. And while that's a mouthful, we also toyed around with something called the weekly availability report, but we couldn't go with that moniker because it translated into war.
And what's that good for?
We also were really focused on the language of postmortem versus retrospective, which Preet will talk a little bit about. The other piece of it was problem team versus solutions team. I don't want to manage problems. Neither did my team. We really wanted to manage solutions. Yes, there's a problem, but let's focus on the solution. And the other piece of it was the concept of a root cause versus approximate cause. Salesforce is a complex system, much like any other complex system that many of you manage sitting in this room. And you're not going to find one single cause for an issue. Most of them are going to be several different proximate causes that feed together to create sort of the explosion that becomes the incident.
Whenever I hear root cause, I have like a single tear roll down my cheek. And I think I got you to that point too, when
yes.
you'd hear it and it's just a single tear.
The emo?
Yeah. So behavior matters too. When you're talking about retrospectives and where you're asking people to sort of be honest and in some sense be vulnerable about what they're doing, behavior in those meetings mattered. So we spent a lot of time observing and really looking at sort of inter-team behavior, people in the smaller meetings, how they're reacting to each other and interacting, what those interactions look like. We did actually a lot of ethnographic research on some of the interactions that we were seeing and trying to get a better understanding of it. And then, of course, in the larger meeting, we were looking at behavior between teams and trying to figure out what was going on there. It's funny. People often talk about, I have a friend who, there's hashtag NAFB, that stands for New Age Fluffy Bunnies. And it's really funny. People talk about, well, there's this behavior stuff. It's just touchy-feely. But, Sidney Dekker has a quote there about people in complex systems create safety. The occasional human contribution to failure occurs precisely because humans have an overwhelming contribution to safety. So it's important to realize that the reasons that we experience failure are the same reasons that we experience success. We often look at the failure, and it's because humans are contributing to that. And if they're in an environment where there's sort of counterproductive behavior or a lot of like finger pointing and arguments and that sort of thing, it's going to limit your ability to sort of explore the human contribution to failure, but also success.
So one of the other things we did was look at the structure. How were we presenting the information? And we realized that we were putting our engineers up into a big heavyweight meeting to basically give a book report. And a lot of them were standing there just like our little friend in front of the classroom, like a deer in headlights. You want me to do what? So started changing that. And part of that was working with the teams in the smaller retrospectives. We realized in those meetings that these teams were actually focusing on writing and rehearsing their book report instead of planning and talking about what had occurred, how they were going to fix it. And so we wanted to really refocus them to work on how they discuss the incidents, not necessarily prepping for a book report and writing slides, but how you discuss it and the outcomes that come from those discussions.
It was really funny. I remember a meeting that we sat in, and there was a particularly sort of serious incident that the team was describing, and they were discussing, and they had just done a great job of sort of discussing it, and then got to the point where the team really felt like they understood the issue, and they were asked, the manager asked, okay, who's going to present this in the weekly meeting? And everyone was like,
not me.
Not it,
Not me.
Right. And so we were sort of looking at that. What we've really been focusing on is more of, especially at the summary meeting, around constructing a narrative, right? A narrative around what a particular cloud is doing, maybe what incidents they ran into, maybe what hurdles they're facing that are not related to an incident, but that may be precursors or indicators of a possible incident because their attention or focus may be somewhere else. Now, what's interesting when I say construct a narrative, a lot of you might think, oh, you mean construct a story, construct a fib. And that's not what I'm talking about at all. These are narratives that are data informed, right? And there were actually a couple of teams in the weekly meeting that were really just naturally inclined to this form of reporting. It was actually really amazing when you sat back and watched it, because we found that when they did their report in the meeting, they had fewer incidents. They were able to sort of contextually answer all of the questions that people had. So there were less pointed questions or questions about what's actually going on, because they were able to say, we had some outages or we're having some trouble with this thing, but we're on it. So that was another kind of fascinating effect of using narrative to kind of tell this story. But whenever they were asked a question where they wanted detailed information, they were always on point with that data. They had it ready to go. So that was really a way that made everyone in the meeting, but then also maybe executives that were there, be able to really have a more deep understanding, because as humans, we understand narrative more than a book report or a graph with a bunch of statistics with bullet points about what happened. So, quick question, a little bit of a survey. For people that are new to this whole blameless postmortem thing, I'm going to ask a question. Let's just be honest. How many people think the term blameless postmortem is kind of bullshit? Like when you hear it, you're like, yeah, you're kind of like, I don't think that actually really exists. Yes, that's why they never happen. Yes. So this is Brené Brown. She's sociologist, I believe, at the University of Austin. She's done a lot of research on interactions, vulnerability. This is from a TED Talk she did actually on the topic of vulnerability. And, it's really interesting. She says the research describes blame as a way to discharge pain and discomfort. We are hardwired as humans by millions of years of evolutionary psychology to blame people. So I always like to say, like, when you go into an environment and say, hey, we're going to do blameless postmortems now, it's kind of like everybody saying, oh, we'll just pretend nobody has arms. And we can see each other's arms like we're playing this game, right? So what we like to talk about is sort of blame-aware postmortems, which is where we are very conscious of the human tendency to sort of do that, and then address that in the moment. It takes a lot of work, but the outcomes are kind of amazing. The other kind of problem with postmortem is a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, nobody died, so why do we have to look at this? Like this isn't a plane crash, nobody died, so let's not do a postmortem, right? Or on the other end, you'll hear, well, postmortems, doesn't that mean like the NTSB shows up and there's this big heavyweight formal thing and they do all this stuff, right? We don't have the time or the money to really do that. What's interesting is those are ways to sort of deflect being vulnerable and being in a vulnerable space and then learning from that. That's why I don't actually like the term postmortem. So we need to find a balance that matches the cognitive context with our organization's need to learn. And that's why we call them retrospectives, and that's also why we try to make them actionable. Now, one thing a lot of people say, oh, awesome postmortems. Let's have an awesome postmortem.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I don't want postmortems that I'm doing to literally inspire awe in my employees or people that I'm working with. They should learn something. It should be a good experience, but I'm not so sure that there should be awe involved, at least every postmortem. So one of the things we also did when we were trying to sort of contextualize for other people that we were working with at Salesforce, trying to help them understand what was going on, is we did what we came up with a DReyfus model for the skills acquisition related to postmortem. Now, those of you familiar with the DReyfus model, it's kind of a 5-point model, but one of the interesting things about it is that it's meant to describe behaviors. So it gives you a bunch of examples of things you might hear or behaviors that you might see in your organization, so that you can sort of understand where people are in the spectrum. And it can be, teams can be in different points, like different individuals can be at different points on the spectrum. And then also, if you look at a broad skill like retrospectives, people can be a novice in one part and maybe competent in another part that can actually have different things based on behaviors. Yep. So we came up with that for retrospectives. So here's an example of some things you might hear. A novice might say, incidents are bad, my job is on the line, so obviously they're bad. They may finish the postmortem paperwork and they think of it as paperwork I got to fill out.
Then we move on to the beginner. The beginner has a little bit more knowledge under their belt. They're more familiar with doing a postmortem. They've been in a couple. But they tend to jump to the focus on the why right away. Why? They also want to say, really, how do we fix this? Got to fix it fast as possible. And they have that kind of beginner energy. Following on that is the competent practitioner. The competent practitioner says, look, we need to find the root cause. And we're going to follow the prescribed format for retrospective. That's the one we saw earlier that we went through in about 15 seconds. Yeah. Again, doesn't work in 15 seconds. Then we move on to the proficient practitioner. The proficient practitioner says, we've established the what. Can we now talk about the how? Let's talk about the how as opposed to the why. The other part that this proficient practitioner can do is identify the inherent bias that they have in themselves, and maybe also start to understand the inherent biases that the other participants in the room have as well.
And then an expert practitioner in terms of retrospectives would ask questions like, how does our team or system contribute to our success? Not just our failures. What are we doing there that makes us successful? And they'll also be able to facilitate retrospectives by healthily helping others address our tendencies to blame, and then also our personal and systemic biases. So Gene asked us to sort of come up with the 5 takeaways, the top 5 list.
Not the 5 whys.
These are the things that hopefully you can take back to your organization when you're looking at doing retrospectives, making them actionable, not calling them postmortems.
Retrospectives facilitate both the service improvement process and the design improvement process. And the biggest thing here is that if you have an improvement process or an improvement team, but you're not doing retrospectives, there's no point.
So being too busy to learn or improve means that you are in a downward spiral by definition, because it turns out entropy. If you're not improving the way that you're working or learning, and you're just focused solely on features or keeping the lights on or whatever it may be, entropy is basically eating away at any past improvements you've made. It's sort of eating you alive. Entropy is mean that way. So the kind of saying is if you're kind of staying static with the way that you do work, you're actually kind of backsliding. So it's not about the outcome, it's about the response. A lot of businesses focus on MTR, customer downtime impact. That's important. I wouldn't say otherwise. But what is really important to take into account is how you respond. The notable takeaway here is focusing on outcomes doesn't fix the next incident. Focusing on response and your team's response, your organizational response, feeds directly into the next incident that you're going to have. Etsy and Netflix, we talk about them as unicorns. Both of them still take postmortems very seriously, their retrospectives very seriously. They continually work on perfecting them. And when they hire new people aboard, they acculturate them to their style of doing retrospectives. So they take it very seriously.
Why and how is more important than the what. This is my personal favorite. As we were observing the smaller conversations and even the one in the bigger meeting, we realized, or I realized, that we're really, really good about talking about what happened. We could talk forever about what happened. But we really need to focus on those nuggets that come from the discussions of the how and the why. How did this happen? Why did this happen? What were the contributing factors? What did we do right? And how do we take what we did right and proliferate that the next time?
And finally, you are never done. Let me repeat that. You are never done. And as a corollary, it takes a longer than you might think. I think, if you think you're going to practice your postmortems for 2 months, call them retrospectives and practice them for 2 months, and it's suddenly magically going to work. That's actually not how it works. This takes a long time to, unfortunately not, to change behavior. So when you do start looking at this, the model is a good place to start. See where you are on that model. Map what your current state is onto that model, and then engage with the artifacts, the tangible things that you produce from a postmortem process or a retrospective process. And this is where actually coaching can be really helpful, because they can help you look at those artifacts and improve that. So it really has to be something that permeates the work that you do. You can't just bolt it on as some sort of improvement process that ends after 2 to 6 months or whatever. People really need to sort of intrinsically live that as they work, as they do their work.
So keeping with our weather theme, because y'all saw the weather theme throughout the presentation, and the flying cows, our forecast for the future, we are working at Salesforce to tailor the concept of service ownership for Salesforce. It's not one size fits all. What service ownership means at Salesforce may not be the same thing that it means at Etsy or Netflix or Yahoo. There's still a basis of service ownership at the base level that we all practice, but there's different nuances when it goes from company to company. The other thing that we're doing is focusing on coaching those teams, documenting some guides, if you will, on how to run a actionable retrospective, focusing on the service health instead of what happened or this individual incident, looking at the system as a whole. And at the end of the day, we're doing all this because we want to give the business what they want, which is a good business outcome. And for infrastructure engineering, which is my team, that means providing a highly available service. And so all of this work and everything that we're doing goes back into ensuring that the service is highly available and reliable.
So the other question Gene had for us to share was how to areas for collaboration, how you can help us. So we would love to see how the DReyfus model that we've come up with applies to other organizations, what kind of things, behaviors, and language that you're seeing that we might be able to add to it. That would be wonderful. And then sharing stories from other enterprises with their retrospectives, who should do them, who is doing them, where they should live within the organization, what kind of processes and procedures you put in your organizations around that. It'd be great to share because that makes us all better at this. Thanks.
That's it. So we actually have time for questions.
I think we do. Any questions? There's bright light, so I can't see hands.
Okay, I have a microphone here. Is anyone?
The light is speaking to us.
I know.
So you said in your old process that it was intended to apply to all incidents. How does the new process apply? Does it still apply to all incidents, or is there still just kind of the big incidents?
It applies to all incidents, but again, with the aspect of coaching the teams and working and focusing in the smaller groups, we're able to talk about the zeros, the ones, the twos, the threes. The old process really was very heavy on getting ready for this big meeting and getting ready to present at this meeting. So we're giving the teams a little bit of breathing room, I guess is the best way to say it. They can sit back and talk about it more. So it still applies to all of them. It's just a different way of approaching.
One of the things I'd say too is it was kind of funny. The old process actually had someone who would give the teams the incidents that they were responsible for reporting on, which is fine. There's certain cases where there's a lot of attention on a particular incident, but with the teams that are doing sort of a structured narrative, they're able to bring in a SEV2 or a SEV3 incident that maybe was interesting to them and they think would be helpful for the broader team and may be an indicator of a SEV1 or a SEV0 incident. And that's gives them the flexibility to bring up to the broader team what they think is important, not just what books they were supposed to read for the book report, to do the book report.
How bought into this is your executive leadership?
Oh, they're very bought into it, actually. They have seen the work that we've been doing and several conversations with them, and part of the status reports and giving them regular updates. They've also seen it in the meetings, the Wednesday meetings. Some of them were coming to us and saying, wow, that went really well, or what did you guys do? It went faster, it was different, it was better. So they're slowly starting to see that the changes we're making are having an effect on our availability, our service, and the way we're approaching problems.
So I have a follow-on question to that, though. Do you guys take like your biggest, worst, like, this is really a big problem for us, incidents to the leadership still? And if you do, who does it?
We do still do that. The person responsible for doing or driving that conversation is the service owner, which in a sense is the cloud leader. So if it's a database incident, it's our database leader that goes and presents and talks about it that way. So we're not hiding things. We're still really focusing on the big incidents, and mainly that's to give our execs the visibility that they need in case they're approached by a customer. But in the smaller, broader meetings, we're painting a picture of how that one incident was part of a greater, probably systemic issue, maybe not, maybe, but we're having those discussions as well. So it's two types of...
And I will note one thing really quickly. So talking about the executives and their sort of view of it, the coaching and working with the teams on that, they've realized that's like so important, and they're seeing some benefit. There's actually a couple of headcounts that have been opened up to help teams perfect this process across the company, which is pretty interesting, I think.
Okay, well, we need to get the next speaker, which is Mark Holbreak, up. So
Thank you.
A round of applause.